###***. Part 1. The Valley of Silver Dust, ****. The wind in this part of the Arizona Territory had a voice, and Jedediah Stone knew its language. It was a coarse whisper that scraped across the red rock and carried the scent of dust, juniper, and distant rain that never fell. For 2 days, that wind had been his only companion as he tracked the predator that was not a mountain lion or a coyote, but something far more wasteful. He crouched behind a sandstone hoodoo, its shape twisted by 1,000,000 years of that same wind, and surveyed the shallow arroyo below. His dark eyes, accustomed to the fierce glare of the sun, missed nothing. The scuff of a displaced stone, the unnatural stillness of a sagebrush, the 3 sheep, their wool matted with dark, dried blood, lay where they had fallen. They hadn't been killed for hunger. The meat was untouched, left to the buzzards and the heat. This was a killing of contempt. Jedediah was a man carved from the land itself. His frame was lean and hard, his skin the color of burnished copper from a life lived under the open sky. At 32, his face was already a map of his past creases around his eyes from squinting into the sun, a firm set to his jaw from years of self-reliance. He had scouted for the Pony Express, guided survey crews through canyons they swore were impassable, and learned that the white man's world was one of sharp lines and written rules, while his was a world of circles and spoken truths. Now, he kept to his own, watching over his family's flocks in the valley his ancestors had called home since the beginning of time. He slid down the loose scree into the arroyo, his moccasins making no sound. The air was thick with the smell of death, kneeling by the nearest ewe. He ignored the flies and examined the wound. A clean hole, small and precise, a rifle. Not the heavy slug of a buffalo gun, but the faster, flatter trajectory of a military or a new Winchester. He ran his fingers through the dust, feeling the faint impressions left behind. The tracks of unshod hooves from the scattered flock were overlaid with something else, the clear, sharp crescent of an iron horseshoe. 2 horses, maybe 3. They had ridden straight through the grazing lands. A place agreed upon by treaty, a piece of paper Jedediah knew was worth less than the sand it was written on. He stood and his gaze swept the horizon, from the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains to the flat, shimmering expanse of the desert floor. In the distance, a column of dust rose against the pale blue sky, a cavalry patrol. He had felt their presence for the last hour, a faint vibration through the soles of his feet, a prickling on his skin. Lieutenant Kincaid's men. They were pushing their patrols further into the treaty lands each month, their blue uniforms a stark, unwelcome color in this world of red and brown. Jedediah didn't wait. He moved with a liquid grace, flowing back into the rock formations, becoming just another shadow among the countless others. To be found here by the cavalry, near dead livestock, would mean questions he had no intention of answering. It would mean being taken to Dry Bluff, a town that suffocated him with its noise, its greed, and its casual disdain for his people. He would find his own justice, in his own way. The horseshoe prints were a clear trail, and they led east, toward the town that clung to the edge of Navajo land like a persistent burr, a town that was getting fat on the silver being torn from the belly of the mountains. Miles away, in a small settlement of Hogans nestled in a protected canyon. Alara felt a different kind of suffocation. It wasn't the dust or the heat, but the heavy blanket of expectation that settled on her shoulders. The air in her family's Hogan was warm, smelling of corn, wool, and the herbs her mother was sorting. Through the single doorway facing east, she could see the parched earth of their small cornfield. The rains had been shy this season, and the creek that was the lifeblood of their valley had shrunk to a timid trickle. A fever, brought by traders, had swept through the village weeks ago, leaving 2 elders gone and several children weak. The people were anxious. Their reserves of salt were low, and the old rifles they used for hunting were unreliable. It was this fear, this slow-burning desperation, that had sealed her fate. She ran a hand over the smooth, cream-colored buckskin dress laid out for her. It was the dress for her purification ceremony, the final ritual before she was to be wed to Silas Boone. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Boone was a white trader from Dry Bluff, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He had offered a deal to the village elder, Nez 20 new repeating rifles, 100 pounds of salt, and a promise of regular supplies. In exchange for her, "It is a good match," Elder Nez had told her, his voice weary, his face a web of deep wrinkles. "He is a powerful man. An alliance with him will protect us. The salt will see us through the winter. The rifles will keep the Apache raiders at bay and allow our hunters to provide." "I am not a sack of flour to be traded," Alara had argued, her voice low but fierce. At 23, she possessed a sharp mind and a spirit that refused to be bridled. Her beauty was not delicate, it was strong, like the desert flowers that bloomed in the harshest conditions. With high cheekbones, intelligent, dark eyes, and a cascade of black hair that fell to her waist. "He does not respect our ways. His men look at our land with hungry eyes." "Your pride will not feed our children," the elder had said, his words a final, heavy stone. "Sometimes, one must sacrifice for the good of the many." Now, the hour of that sacrifice was approaching. Tonight, under the full moon, she was to go to the sacred creek, bathe in its waters, and anoint herself with corn pollen. A prayer for a fruitful life, a life bound to a man she despised, a man who, she felt with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, wanted more than just a wife. He wanted the land she stood on. He wanted the water in their creek. He wanted the silver rumored to be hidden deep in their canyons. Her younger brother, Caleb, burst into the hogan, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and excitement. At 17, he was a bundle of restless energy, fiercely protective of his sister and suspicious of all outsiders. "I saw them," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the doorway. "Boone's men. 2 of them, hiding in the junipers on the ridge above the sacred creek." Ilara's blood ran cold. What were they doing? Watching, just watching. They weren't traitors. Ilara, they had rifles, and one wore a pistol, low on his hip, like a gunslinger. Her deepest fears solidified into a terrifying certainty. The sacred creek was the heart of their valley. To spy on it, especially on the night of a purification rite, was a profound violation. This wasn't about an alliance. It was about surveillance. It was about positioning. Boone wasn't securing a partnership. He was scouting a prize. The marriage was just a key to unlock the gate. "You must tell Elder Nez," she urged, her hands clenching into fists. Caleb scoffed. "He will not listen. He listens only to the rumbling in his belly and the promises of that snake Boone." He looked at his sister, his youthful anger softening into concern. "What will you do?" "I will complete the ceremony," Ilara said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "It is for the people, but I will not be a lamb led to slaughter. My eyes will be open." As twilight bled across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and violet, Jedediah made his camp in a shallow cave overlooking the valley. He built no fire, its light a beacon he could not afford. He ate dry jerky and drank sparingly from his canteen, his senses tuned to the night. The shod horse tracks had led him here, to this high vantage point. From here, he could see the distant, flickering lights of Dry Bluff, a hive of activity even at this hour. Closer, nestled in the protective arm of the canyons, he could see the faint, warm glow of the cooking fires from the Navajo settlement, his settlement. He had heard the rumors in the sparse conversations he'd had with other herdsmen. Rumors of a new deal between the silver mines, Lieutenant Kincaid, and a trader named Boone. They spoke of a new, faster route to get the ore wagons to the railroad, a route that would cut straight through the heart of the valley, through the best grazing land, through the lands watered by the sacred creek. The pieces clicked into place with the cold, hard certainty of a rifle bolt sliding home. The dead sheep were a message, a provocation. The cavalry patrols were a show of force, an intimidation, and the shod tracks, they were the trespass, the first step in a slow, deliberate invasion. A familiar anger, cold and sharp, settled in his chest. He had seen this story play out before, in other valleys, with other tribes. It always began with a broken promise and ended in bloodshed. He pulled a small, worn leather pouch from his belt. Inside was a heavy silver compass, its face scratched and its needle true. It had belonged to his father, a man who had taught him how to read the land, the sky, and the hearts of men. His father had believed a man's word was his bond and honor was his only true north. Jedediah wondered what he would make of this new world, where words were twisted and honor was sold for silver dust. The wind shifted, carrying a new scent on its current, the clean, sacred smell of burning cedar from the village. They were praying for rain, praying for health, praying for a peace he knew was about to be broken. Down in the canyon, Alara walked toward the creek. The moon was rising, a perfect silver disk that bathed the white canyon walls in an ethereal glow. 2 older women from the village walked with her, their faces solemn, their voices a low, rhythmic chant. But Alara's mind was not on the chants or the prayers. It was on Caleb's words. Asterisk, they were watching. She carried the small pouch of sacred corn pollen. She wore the ceremonial dress. She walked the path her mother and grandmother had walked before her. She was playing her part in a ritual meant to ensure harmony and continuation. But inside, a rebellion was brewing. The water of the creek was meant to purify her, to wash away the past and prepare her for the future. But the future they had chosen for her was a cage. And as she looked up at the moon, cold and serene in the vast, dark sky, she made a silent vow. She would not enter it willingly. The valley had a voice. And tonight, so would she. ###****, Part 2, The Bride Beneath the Moon. ****. The 2 women left her as was custom, their soft chants fading as they returned to the path leading back to the village. Alara was alone. The moonlight was so brilliant, it felt solid, pooling in the canyon like liquid silver and casting the surrounding cliffs in stark relief. The water of the sacred creek, flowing over smooth, pale stones, was frigid against her skin. It was meant to be a baptism, a cleansing of her maiden spirit to prepare her for a new life. As she dipped her hands into the current, the cold shock was a welcome jolt, a reminder that she was alive, that her blood still flowed with a will of its own. She closed her eyes, not to pray for the future Elder Nez had chosen for her, but to listen. The night was not silent. A gentle breeze whispered through the salt bush, and the creek murmured its endless story. But beneath that, she strained to hear what should not be there. For a long moment, there was nothing. Perhaps Caleb had been mistaken. Perhaps her own fear was making phantoms on the ridge. Then she heard it, the faint chink of metal on rock. Her eyes snapped open, fixed on the dark line of the canyon rim. It was a sound a deer would not make, nor a coyote. It was the sound of a rifle barrel carelessly nudged against stone, or a spur on a boot heel. They were there, watching. The sanctity of this moment, of this place, meant nothing to them. A cold, venomous anger coiled in her stomach, eclipsing her fear. This ceremony was no longer a sacred rite. It was a performance for an unseen, hostile audience. The marriage was not an alliance. It was an annexation. Her decision was instantaneous. She would not finish the ritual. She would not anoint herself with pollen for a life of subjugation. She had to warn Elder Nez, to give him this undeniable proof of Boone's treachery, to see for himself. Scrambling from the water, her skin slick and cold in the night air, She reached for the ceremonial buckskin dress. Her fingers fumbled with the ties, her movements clumsy with haste. There wasn't time. She could hear a low murmur of voices now, carried on the wind from the ridge. She abandoned the dress, grabbing instead the simple woven tunic she had worn to the creek. It was thin protection against the night's chill, but it was better than nothing. She pulled it over her head, the damp fabric clinging to her skin, and without a backward glance, she turned from the sacred pool and ran. She did not take the main path back to the village. They would be watching it. Instead, she plunged into the dense thicket of rabbit brush and greasewood that lined the canyon floor, aiming for a less-traveled game trail that would take her to the elder's hogan from the west. The branches clawed at her bare legs and arms, leaving angry red welts. Her feet, bare and wet, slipped on the loose stones. The only thought in her mind was a frantic prayer asterisk. Let him listen. Let him see the truth. It was the smell that stopped her, thick, coppery, and raw, the scent of a fresh kill. Her steps faltered. A low growl rumbled from the shadows ahead, a sound that vibrated deep in her chest. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The moon cast long, distorted shadows, and from them, shapes began to emerge. Low, lean bodies moving with a predatory grace. A pair of yellow eyes gleamed, then another and another, a pack of desert wolves. They had been drawn by the scent of a carcass, likely one of the sheep from the recent attack, dragged into the canyon by a scavenger. They were not hunting her, not yet, but she had stumbled directly into their territory, a frightened, fleeing creature reeking of fear. The alpha, a large male with a grizzled gray coat, took a step forward, its lips peeling back from its teeth in a silent snarl. Ilara backed away slowly, her mind racing. She was trapped. The steep, slick rock of the canyon wall was to her left. To her right was a dense, thorny thicket of mesquite she could never hope to push through. The wolves were in front of her. She searched the ground for a weapon, her eyes darting frantically. Her hand closed around a fist-sized rock, its weight a small, desperate comfort. She took another step back, and her bare heel landed on a patch of wet, mossy stone hidden in the shadows. Her feet shot out from under her. She cried out as she fell, her head striking the canyon wall with a dull thud. Dazed, she slid down the rock face, her fall broken by a tangle of thorny bushes at its base. Pain flared along her arm, where the thorns had pierced her skin. She was wedged, her leg twisted beneath her at an awkward angle, the rock at her back and the mesquite thorns digging into her side. The wolves, startled by her sudden movement and cry, had paused, but now they began to advance again, their earlier caution replaced by a bold curiosity. From his vantage point on the opposite ridge, Jedediah had seen it all. He had followed the shod tracks to the perimeter of the canyon, his instincts screaming that this was where the riders had gone. When he saw the ceremony begin below, he understood. They weren't just trespassing, they were observing, waiting. He saw the glint of moonlight on a rifle barrel from the ridge across from him, and knew the girl's brother had been right. He was about to circle around to get a better look at the hidden men when he saw Ilara flee. He saw her plunge into the brush, and, a moment later, he caught the scent of blood on the wind. He knew what it meant. The valley's wolf pack was old and clever. He also knew they were not typically a threat to the people, but a lone person, running and afraid, stumbling upon a fresh kill that changed the rules of the night. When she fell, and the pack began to close in, he didn't hesitate. There was no time to be quiet, no time for stealth. He grabbed a dead resin-rich branch of greasewood, wrapped a piece of oiled cloth from his pack around one end, and struck a match. The branch flared to life, a sudden, angry tongue of fire in the moonlight. Asterisk, hash-ye, asterisk. His voice was a raw, powerful roar that echoed off the canyon walls, a command in the old tongue for the beasts to go. He scrambled down the rocky incline, The torch held high, its light dancing and casting monstrous, leaping shadows. The wolves, confronted with the sudden appearance of fire and the commanding shout of a two-legged predator, scattered. They were opportunists, not warriors. They melted back into the shadows they had come from, their yellow eyes lingering for a moment before vanishing completely. Jedediah slowed his approach, his heart still pounding from the descent. The firelight from his torch illuminated the scene: the girl, tangled in the thorns, her thin tunic torn, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and defiance. He saw the vulnerability of her position, the scraped skin on her arms, and the way she shivered. Whether from cold or shock, he could not tell. He stopped a respectful distance away. He could see the elegant line of her throat, the curve of her shoulder, the long, strong line of her legs, scratched and muddied. He felt a sudden, protective instinct, sharp and fierce. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in a very long time. Without a word, he shrugged off the heavy wool blanket cloak he wore draped over his shoulders. He held it out, his eyes deliberately averted, his gaze fixed on the canyon wall above her head. He kept his own body positioned to block the view from the ridge where Boone's men might still be watching. "Here," he said, his voice low and calm. "The night wind is cold." Elara stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized him now. Jedediah Stone, a man who kept to himself, whose skills as a tracker were spoken of in whispers. He had not looked at her with pity or with avarice. He had looked away. It was a gesture of profound respect, a shield offered in a moment of utter defenselessness. She reached out a trembling hand and took the cloak. The rough wool was warm, heavy, and smelled of wood smoke, pine, and the man himself. She pulled it around her shoulders, the thick fabric a comforting weight that chased away the worst of the chill. He still did not look at her directly. "I saw the wolves before I saw you," he said, his voice steady, answering the unasked question of what he was doing there. He finally let his eyes meet hers, and they were dark and serious. Under the moonlight, a man ought to keep another soul alive first. The simple, practical truth of his words cut through her shock. He wasn't a savior from a story. He was a man of the desert, and life was the desert's most precious commodity. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She tried to untangle her leg, but a sharp pain shot through her ankle. "I think I am stuck." He nodded, jamming the torch into a crevice in the rocks where it cast a steady light. He moved toward her, his motions efficient and careful. "Tell me where it hurts." He gently pushed back a thorny branch, his fingers brushing her arm as he worked to free her. His touch was firm and impersonal, yet the brief contact sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Once she was free, she tried to stand, but her ankle buckled, and she cried out softly. Jedediah caught her arm, steadying her. "You've twisted it. You cannot walk back to the village tonight?" He looked up the path in the direction of the settlement. "It is not wise to return now, in any case." Elara's resolve returned in a rush. "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I will not return. Not yet. The marriage is a trap." Jedediah listened, his face impassive, as she explained in a torrent of urgent whispers about Caleb's warning, the men on the ridge, her certainty that Boone wanted the valley's water and land, not a wife. He felt a familiar weariness settle upon him. He had wanted no part of this. To interfere was to place himself between his own people's desperate decisions and the relentless greed of men like Boone and Kincaid. It was a fight with no clean victory. He was a tracker, a guardian of the flock, not a warrior or a chief. His path was a solitary one. But he had seen the rifle on the ridge. He had found the slaughtered sheep. He had saved this woman from the wolves. The threads of their separate lives had just been irrevocably tangled together by the events of the last hour. To turn his back on her now, to leave her to her fate, would be to dishonor the memory of his father and everything he stood for. It would be a betrayal of the land itself. He looked at her face, Illuminated by the flickering torchlight, he saw not just fear, but courage. He saw not a helpless victim, but a woman who had chosen to run toward danger to protect her home. "You speak the truth," he said, his voice quiet. "Returning to the village now will only get you silenced. They will not believe you over the promise of salt and rifles." "What am I to do?" she asked, her gaze searching his. Jedediah looked up at the moon, then back at the dark, sheltering shadows of the canyon. "There is a wind shelter cave not far from here. It is dry and hidden from view. You will be safe there until morning." He paused, his decision made. "When the sun is up, we will see what the light reveals. I will take you back, if it is safe." He then bent down and, without another word, gently lifted her into his arms. Ilara gasped, startled by the sudden intimacy, but his hold was secure and respectful. He carried her as if she weighed nothing, his cloak still wrapped securely around her. As he moved away from the torchlight and into the deep shadows of the canyon, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. She was a bride who had fled her own cleansing, saved by a hunter under the cold, watchful eye of the moon. And as he carried her toward an uncertain dawn, she knew her old life was over, and a new, far more dangerous one had just begun. ###*, Part 3, A Trail of Whispers and Dust, ***. Dawn broke, not with a gentle blush, but with a sharp, silver edge that cut across the eastern sky. In the cramped, cold shelter of the cave, Ilara woke to the smell of brewing juniper tea. Jedediah was already awake, a silent silhouette against the growing light, his attention fixed on the valley below. He had given her the space of the small cave while he kept watch at its mouth through the night. The heavy wool cloak was still wrapped around her, a cocoon of warmth against the pre-dawn chill. "My ankle is better," she said, testing it carefully. The sharp pain had subsided into a dull, insistent ache. He turned, his face unreadable in the dim light. "It is sprained. You will not be able to run on it." He handed her a tin cup of the hot, fragrant tea. "But you can walk. I will help you." There was no question of her staying. Her place was with her people, to face what she had done and to make them see the truth she had uncovered. The journey back was slow and arduous. Jedediah fashioned a crude crutch for her from a sturdy branch. But for much of the way, he supported her, his arm a firm, steady presence around her waist. They moved in silence, a pact of necessity that felt deeper than words. He was acutely aware of her fragility and her strength, of the way she set her jaw against the pain with every step. She was aware of his quiet competence, the way his eyes constantly scanned the landscape, missing nothing. They did not see the two men from the ridge. Their tracks, Jedediah noted, had vanished, heading back toward Dry Bluff. Boone's spies had seen enough. When they reached the edge of the settlement, the familiar rhythm of village life was gone. There was no sound of women grinding corn, no laughter of children playing. Instead, a tense, accusatory silence hung in the air. Figures emerged from the hogans, their faces grim. The two women who had escorted her to the creek stood with their arms crossed, their expressions a mixture of piety and indignation. The story had arrived before she had. The bride had abandoned the sacred rite. She had shamed her ancestors and her clan. Her brother Caleb was the first to reach her, his face a storm of worry and relief. He ignored Jedediah and rushed to her side. "They say you ran, that you are cursed." "I ran to warn us," she said, her voice clear and loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. Elder Nez emerged from his hogan, his movements slow and deliberate, his face etched with a profound weariness. His eyes fell on Ilara, leaning on Jedediah for support, and his disappointment was a palpable thing. "You have brought shame to your family, daughter," he said, his voice heavy. "You broke faith with the spirits and with your people." "No," Ilara replied. pushing herself away from Jedediah to stand on her own. Though her ankle throbbed in protest, she would not be seen as a weakling being returned by an outsider. The shame is not mine. It belongs to the man who would desecrate our sacred places. She recounted everything, her voice ringing with conviction. She told them of the sounds, of the glint of metal on the ridge, of Caleb's warning. She pointed toward the tracks Jedediah had found. Ask Jedediah Stone. He found our sheep slaughtered, killed by rifles, not by predators. He found the tracks of shod horses on our grazing lands. These are Boone's men. The marriage is not an alliance. It is an invasion. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some looked toward Jedediah, who gave a single, solemn nod. The girl speaks the truth. I saw the tracks. I saw the men on the ridge. But his confirmation was met with suspicion. He was not one of them. Not truly. He was a man of the mountains, who kept his own counsel. An aunt of Ilara's stepped forward, her face pinched with anger. You speak of tracks and shadows. We speak of survival. Boone's salt will save our sick. His rifles will feed our families. You would throw this away for a maiden's fears, for your own selfish pride. The accusation struck home. It was the heart of their dilemma. Pride versus survival. Tradition versus the bitter realities of a changing world. Elder Nez looked from Ilara's impassioned face to the anxious faces of his people. He saw the truth in her eyes, but he also felt the cold weight of his responsibility. A shod horse can be anyone, he said, his voice losing its authority, becoming the thin reed of a man trapped. A dead sheep can be the work of rustlers. Your fears are strong, Ilara, but Boone's promises are solid. They are real. We are out of time. He turned away, unable to meet her gaze, and the crowd began to disperse, leaving Ilara standing with only Caleb and the silent tracker by her side. The seed of doubt had been planted, but it had fallen on dry, desperate ground. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In Dry Bluff, the air tasted of grit, whiskey, and greed. The town was a raw scar on the landscape, a chaotic collection of false-fronted buildings, saloons, and assay offices, all existing for the singular purpose of tearing silver from the earth. In the back office of his trading post, a room cluttered with ledgers, saddles, and crates of ammunition. Silas Boone poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He pushed one across the polished oak desk to Lieutenant Ephraim Kincaid. Boone was a man whose physical size seemed designed to take up as much space as possible. He was thick-set, with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing. Kincaid, by contrast, was lean and impeccably dressed in his blue uniform, his posture ramrod straight. He held himself with an air of aristocratic disdain for the crude world he operated in, but his eyes held the same avaricious glint as Boone's. So the little bride got spooked, Boone said, taking a healthy swallow of his whiskey. My men said she ran off mid-ceremony. Made quite a scene, I hear. This complicates things. Silas, Kincaid said, his voice a clipped, educated baritone. The agreement was for a peaceful consolidation. The marriage was to be our proof of their cooperation, a legal anchor. It's a hitch, not a hangman's knot, Boone grunted. He leaned forward, his bulk straining the buttons of his vest. The goal is the same, get them off that land. That valley is the only direct route for the ore wagons that doesn't require 3 extra days and a guard detail through Apache territory. The Silver King Consolidated will pay a fortune for that right-of-way, and our mutual investment in that company will flourish, Kincaid added smoothly. But without their consent, moving them will require an official order. It will be messy. That's why we changed the story, Boone said, a sly grin spreading across his face. The girl didn't just run. She's a thief. I paid the bride price in advance a crate of goods, some blankets, a few trinkets. She took them and fled. It's a simple matter of theft. Kincaid raised an eyebrow, a flicker of appreciation in his eyes. A criminal matter, within the jurisdiction of the territorial authorities. Exactly. You issue a warrant for her arrest on my complaint. I'll provide the posse to assist your deputy in serving it. We'll bring her back here to face justice. Once she's in my custody, the old elder will be a lot more agreeable to the original terms to secure her return. We still get our anchor, just by a different rope." He refilled his glass. "Either way, that valley is ours by Christmas." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Jedediah left Alara in the care of her brother. He knew words would not be enough to sway the elder. He needed something more, something undeniable. He rode his buckskin mare toward Dry Bluff, the town's dust cloud a smudge of corruption on the horizon. He moved with a purpose, his jaw set. He bypassed the main street, tying his horse in a back alley before making his way to a small, neat adobe house on the edge of town. A sign hanging by the door read, "Mary O'Rourke, midwife and herbalist." Mary was a woman in her 50s, with fiery red hair fading to gray and the clear, direct eyes of someone who had seen both the beginning and the end of life too many times to be fooled by anything in between. She welcomed Jedediah with a nod and a cup of strong tea. "It's a bad business, Jedediah," she said before he could even speak, her Irish lilt softening the harsh words. "I've heard the whispers from the mining camps. Boone's been making these arrangements for months. A girl from a broke prospector's family, another whose father owed a gambling debt. He sets them up in shacks with miners, taking a cut of their wages in return for the girl's keep. He's not collecting wives, he's collecting assets." The ugly picture solidified in Jedediah's mind. Alara was not just a key to the land. She was another piece of property to be leveraged. Her people are desperate. Mary, they won't see it. "Desperate people make for blind eyes," she said grimly. "Be careful. Boone has the law in his pocket here. The sheriff is a drunk and the lieutenant, Kincaid, is a snake in a soldier's coat." As he left Mary's house, a young man in a dusty coat detached himself from the shadows of a nearby livery. It was Deputy Cole, a man barely out of his teens, his face pale and earnest under the brim of his hat. "Stone," he said, his voice low and nervous. "A word." Jedediah waited, his expression neutral, his hand resting near the knife on his belt. "I was in the sheriff's office," Cole stammered, avoiding Jedediah's gaze. "Boone was there, with Kincaid. They've drawn up a warrant for the Navajo girl. Alara. They're claiming she stole goods from him. It's a lie. I know it is. But the paper is official. Boone is gathering men to ride out at sunset to bring her in." The trap was set. It was no longer about persuasion. It was about possession. "Thank you," Jedediah said, the two words carrying a weight of respect for the young man's courage. Cole simply nodded and disappeared back into the alley, a small flicker of conscience in a town that had sold its own. Jedediah untied his horse, his mind a whirlwind. He had to get back. He had to warn them. As he spurred the mare out of town, he felt a change in the air. The wind, which had been a constant, steady presence, was beginning to shift. It picked up a new, violent energy, whipping dust and grit into the air. The sky to the west was turning a sickly yellow-brown. Within minutes, the world dissolved. A sandstorm, born of the vast, dry plains, descended upon the valley with the fury of a living thing. The wind howled, a physical force that tore at his clothes and threatened to push his horse off its feet. Visibility shrank to a few feet. The sun was obliterated. The air was a suffocating, blinding torrent of sand that scoured the landscape, erasing tracks, landmarks, and any sense of direction. He was forced to stop, turning his horse's back to the wind and pulling his neckerchief over his face. Hunkering down behind a rock outcropping, the storm was a force of nature, indifferent and absolute. It wiped the slate clean, erasing the tracks of Boone's men, the hoofprints of his own horse, any physical proof he might have had. In that howling, chaotic darkness, there was no trail to follow, no clear path forward. There was only the whisper of the lawman's warning and the image of Alara's defiant face, isolated and vulnerable, waiting for a storm of a different kind that was about to break upon her. ###***. Part 4, The Vow by the Juniper Smoke, ****. The sandstorm had passed, but it had left the world raw and exposed. A fine red dust coated everything, filling the air with a coppery haze and clinging to the back of the throat. The tension in the village was just as thick. Elara was an outcast in her own home, the subject of angry whispers and fearful glances. But the shame they tried to force upon her had instead annealed into a core of pure resolve. Desperation had made her people blind. She would have to find a way to make them see. She went to the women first. She gathered them not in the center of the village, but near the communal looms, a place of female power and creation. She spoke not of visions or fears, but of practicalities. "Elder Nez made a bargain to feed us," she began, her voice steady and clear, carrying over the hum of the wind. "He traded a daughter for salt, but we are not a people with only one daughter to sell. We have hands that weave. We have knowledge of the herbs that grow in these canyons, remedies the white people in Dry Bluff pay well for. Our wool blankets are warmer than any they can buy from a factory." She laid out her plan, a vision of self-reliance forged in the face of despair. "We cancel the marriage to Boone. In its place, we offer a new trade agreement, direct to the people of Dry Bluff, our blankets, our medicines, our woven goods, for their salt, their flour, their steel. We will coordinate it ourselves. We will set the terms. We will not be dependents. We will be partners." A flicker of hope ignited in the eyes of the younger women. They saw the logic, the dignity in her proposal. But the older generation was hesitant, their faces etched with the fear of upsetting a fragile balance. "You would defy the elder," one asked, "and anger a powerful man like Silas Boone." "Boone is already angered," Elara countered. "His anger is not the issue. Our survival, on our own terms, is." The news of her proposal traveled through the village as quickly as the dust had settled. It was an act of rebellion, a direct challenge to the elder's authority and Boone's plan. And Boone, who had eyes and ears even within the secluded canyon, did not wait long to strike back. His poison was delivered through a young man named Navajo, whose family had fallen on hard times and who saw a path to favor and wealth by aligning himself with the white trader. That evening, as the last light faded and a nervous quiet settled over the Hogans, Navajo and 2 other disgruntled youths, their courage bolstered by a bottle of cheap whiskey from Boone's stores, put the next phase of the plan into motion. Their target was the Medicine Hogan, where Elara's mother, a respected healer, kept her stores of herbs. A volley of rocks suddenly pelted the dried mud walls, one smashing a clay pot left outside the door. Witchcraft. Navon's voice slurred in the darkness. "The bride has broken the rites. She has brought a curse upon us. The spirits are angry. This sickness is her fault." The accusations were a vile, calculated attack, meant to twist belief into a weapon and isolate Elara completely. Caleb, enraged, burst from his family's hogan, followed by his cousins. A frantic, ugly scuffle broke out in the dusty clearing, a fight of brother against brother, stoked by outside influence. It was short and brutal. In the chaos, Caleb swung a heavy piece of firewood, catching Navajo squarely on the side of the knee. The young man went down with a cry of agony, clutching his leg. His 2 companions, suddenly sobered, vanished into the night. The fight was over, but the damage was done. The community was fractured. As Elara and her mother rushed to Navajo's side, the crowd that gathered watched with a mixture of fear and resentment. He had attacked their home, but he was still one of their own, and now he was injured. "Bring him inside," Elara's mother commanded, her healer's instincts overriding any anger. They carried Navajo into the hogan, the air thick with the scent of crushed sage and disbelief. His leg was badly broken, the bone jutting at an unnatural angle, as her mother worked to calm him and prepare a splint. Elara was tasked with cutting away the fabric of his leggings to assess the wound. As she did, her fingers brushed against a small, stiff object tucked into a leather pouch on his belt. Her curiosity piqued. She worked it free under the guise of steadying his leg. It was a piece of folded paper, dirty and creased, hiding it in the palm of her hand. She waited until her mother was fully absorbed in setting the bone before she slipped away into a dark corner of the hogan. She unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a letter. It was a map, crudely drawn but terrifyingly clear. It showed their valley, with familiar landmarks sketched in charcoal. But there was a new, stark line drawn straight through it, marked with symbols she didn't understand but recognized as survey markers. The line cut directly across the sacred creek, severing it from the main grazing lands and the village itself. At the bottom, in messy script, were the words, "New Kincaid Boundary per SB." Agreement. The breath left her body. This was the proof. The marriage wasn't just a trade. It wasn't just a foothold. It was the signature on a contract she had never seen. The agreement with Silas Boone would mean the village was unknowingly ceding its water source, its very lifeblood. They were being tricked into giving away their own heart. Just then, a shadow fell across the doorway. Jedediah Stone stepped inside, his clothes covered in a fine layer of red dust. He had fought his way through the end of the storm, his return hastened by the deputy's warning. His eyes took in the scene, the injured man, the tense faces, and Alara, standing in the shadows, her face pale as bone. She met his gaze and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head. Asterisk, not here. He understood immediately. He helped calm the agitated villagers, and then, as the commotion died down, he drew Alara outside. The air had grown heavy and humid, the sky a bruised purple. Distant lightning flickered silently behind the mountains. A different kind of storm was coming. "Boone has a warrant for you," he said, his voice a low rumble, a false claim of theft. "He's coming with a posse to take you." "Let them come," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. She held out the crumpled map. "I have this. He won't take me. He will not take our water." Jedediah took the map, his expression hardening into granite as he understood its meaning. "This changes everything. This is not a matter for the elder anymore. This is a matter for the law, the white man's law." As he spoke, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dry earth with a sizzle. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of ozone and wet creosote. Within moments, the drizzle became a deluge, a violent thunderstorm that turned the dust to mud and sent everyone running for shelter. "We have to go," Jedediah said, grabbing her arm. "Navon will wake. He'll know the map is gone. The posse could be here any minute." He led her away from the village, into the teeth of the storm. The rain was a blinding, deafening curtain, washing away their tracks as soon as they were made. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the canyon in stark, terrifying flashes. They scrambled for shelter, finally finding it in a small, three-sided lean-to used by shepherds during the lambing season. It was little more than a crude roof of branches and mud against a rock face, but it was dry. They huddled together in the cramped space, the storm raging around them. The roar of the wind and rain created a bubble of strange intimacy, a pocket of quiet in the heart of the chaos. "I am afraid," Alara admitted, her voice barely a whisper. She wasn't afraid of the storm, but of the cold, calculated evil on the map she still clutched in her hand. "They see our land as empty. They see us as ghosts, already gone." Jedediah looked at her, at the rain plastering her dark hair to her face, at the fierce, determined light that burned in her eyes, the guard he kept around himself. The solitary wall he had built over years began to crumble. "My father told me our honor is our land," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Not the dirt and rocks, but the promise to protect it, to live with it in the right way. "I have spent years keeping to myself, believing that was the way to keep that promise. I was wrong." He reached out and his hand gently covered hers, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist. The warmth of his touch was a startling anchor in the cold. violent night. It was a simple gesture, but it held more meaning than 1,000 flowery words. It was an acknowledgement of their shared fate, of the fight that was now theirs to wage together. Exhausted, overwhelmed, Alara leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not stiffen or pull away. He remained solid, a bulwark against the storm. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the rain. Two souls bound by a common purpose and a dawning, unspoken affection. "We will not let them win," he said into the darkness. He took his hand from hers and gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze in the gloom. "We will keep each other alive, and we will keep each other true." It was not a promise of love, but something harder and more vital. It was a vow of alliance, of absolute loyalty, a promise to reflect the truth back to each other, even when the world was full of lies. As the storm began to subside, replaced by the steady drumming of rain, their path became clear. "The circuit judge is in Prescott," Jedediah said. "He is a hard man, but they say he is fair. He dislikes Kincaid and has no love for the mining companies. This map, a legal document from their own side. He will have to look at it." "Then we go to Prescott," Alara said, her voice firm. "Together." "It's a 2-day ride, hard and fast, and we'll need help." He thought of the young deputy. "I need to get word to Cole. If we have a lawman on our side when we present this, the judge will have to listen." They left before the first hint of dawn, slipping out of the lean-to into a world washed clean by the storm. They took Jedediah's horse and one Alara's family kept for long journeys. Their personal vow, made in the heart of a storm, had now become a desperate gamble for justice, a race against the posse that was surely on its way. *******, part the ambush at Raven Narrows, *****. The trail to Prescott was a treacherous ribbon of rock and sand that wound its way through the unforgiving landscape. They rode hard, pushing the horses, with Jedediah in the lead, his eyes scanning every ridge and shadow. Behind him, Alara rode with the map tucked securely inside her tunic, its sharp corners a constant, pressing reminder of what was at stake. Deputy Cole brought up the rear, his youthful face a mask of nervous determination, his hand rarely straying from the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip. He was a boy playing a man's game, but his courage was genuine. Jedediah led them toward Raven Narrows, a deep, sheer-walled canyon that was the fastest but most dangerous route through the foothills. The towering rock walls amplified every sound, the clip-clop of their horses' hooves, the creak of saddle leather, the anxious breathing of the deputy. "Something's not right," Jedediah said, pulling his horse to a halt. The air was unnaturally still. The usual calls of birds and insects silenced. "The canyon is too quiet." His words hung in the air for a heartbeat, and then the quiet was shattered. A rifle shot cracked from the rim above, the sound echoing like a thunderclap between the narrow walls. A chip of rock exploded from the cliff face scant inches from Alara's head. "Ambush," Jedediah yelled, drawing the heavy pistol from his belt. Chaos erupted. More shots rained down from both sides of the canyon, the bullets whining and ricocheting off the stone. Cole's horse screamed and reared, throwing the young deputy to the ground. Alara fought to control her panicked mount as Jedediah returned fire. His shots aimed not to kill but to suppress, to give them a moment's grace. A burly, bearded man, one of Boone's hired guns, slid down a scree slope and landed almost on top of Alara. He lunged, grabbing for her, his eyes fixed on the front of her tunic. She lashed out with her riding crop, striking him across the face, but he was too strong. His fingers hooked into the collar of her tunic and ripped, tearing the fabric. He snatched the folded map as it fell free. "Got it!" he roared to his companions above. Jedediah spurred his horse forward, knocking the man aside. But 2 more gunmen were descending, their pistols drawn. He was pinned, forced to defend himself. At that moment, Cole, dazed but on his feet, raised his own pistol. He fired, and one of the gunmen cried out, clutching a wounded shoulder. But another shot from above struck Cole, spinning him around. He collapsed behind a cluster of boulders, a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. The objective was complete. The men who had the map began to scramble back up the canyon walls. "Let's go," their leader yelled. Boone just wanted the paper. As the last of the shots faded, an even more terrifying sound began to fill the canyon. It started as a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt more than heard. Jedediah's head snapped up, his eyes widening. He had seen the dark, bruised clouds gathering over the high peaks all morning. The rain from the previous night's storm had saturated the high country. "Flash flood," he screamed. To the bridge now. Downstream, a rickety wooden bridge, built by prospectors years ago, spanned the 30-foot gap of the dry wash. It was their only way out. He galloped toward Cole, pulling the injured deputy onto his own horse. Ilara was right behind him, her face pale with shock but her hands steady on the reins. The rumble grew into a deafening roar. A wall of brown water, churning with uprooted trees and debris, appeared at the bend in the canyon, a monstrous, unstoppable wave. They raced for the bridge, the horses' hooves thundering on the hard-packed earth. They were halfway across when the full force of the flood hit the bridge's supports. The old wood groaned, shuddering violently. Ilara's horse, terrified by the roar and the shaking ground, lost its footing. With a shrill cry, it went down, throwing Ilara from the saddle. She was flung over the side of the collapsing bridge and into the raging torrent. Ilara Jedediah's cry was ripped away by the sound of splintering wood. Without a second thought, he pushed the wounded deputy into the relative safety of the far bank and plunged into the churning water after her. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath. The current was a brutal, muscular force, pulling him under, tumbling him head over heels. He fought his way to the surface, gasping for air, his eyes scanning the maelstrom. He saw her, a flash of dark hair and pale skin, being swept toward a tangle of debris. He swam with a desperate strength, his powerful strokes barely gaining ground against the flood. He reached her just as she was about to be crushed by a floating log. Grabbing a handful of her tunic and pulling her head above water, she was conscious, coughing and sputtering, her eyes wide with terror. "Hold on," he yelled over the roar. He fought to angle them toward the canyon wall, searching for a handhold, anything to stop their downstream rush. The current slammed them against the rock face. As he struggled to keep their heads above water, a particularly violent surge ripped at them. He felt a sharp tug at his belt, heard the snap of old leather, and felt a familiar weight suddenly vanish. The small leather pouch containing his father's silver compass, his guide, his connection to his past, his one true inheritance was torn away. For a split second, he saw it, a dark shape tumbling in the brown water. Before it was gone forever, a piece of his soul was ripped away with it, but he didn't hesitate. His grip on Ilara was all that mattered. He tightened his hold, sacrificing the symbol of his direction to save the life in his arms. With a final, desperate heave, he found a ledge of rock and pulled them both from the deadly current, collapsing onto the muddy bank, gasping and shivering. They lay there for a long moment, the floodwaters raging just feet below them. They had survived, but the map was gone. His compass was gone. They had nothing. A shout from across the wash cut through their exhaustion. One of Boone's men, a lanky youth who had been cut off from the others by the flood, stood on the opposite bank. And he was not alone. He held a struggling figure in front of him, a knife pressed to the boy's throat. It was Caleb. He must have followed them, worried for his sister's safety. He had walked straight into the aftermath of the ambush. "Looks like I get a prize after all," the man yelled, his voice thin and reedy across the roaring water. "A trade. Little lady, your brother for you, Boone, will be real pleased." The world seemed to tilt on its axis for Ilara. She looked at her brother's terrified face, his eyes pleading with her. She looked at Jedediah, his face grim, his knuckles white where he gripped the rock. He had lost everything to save her, and it still wasn't enough. "Don't do it, Ilara," Jedediah said, his voice low and ragged. "It's a trick. We can track them. We can find another way." But Ilara saw the sharp edge of the blade against her brother's skin. She saw the fear in Caleb's eyes. Another way. A chance. She couldn't gamble her brother's life on a chance. The immediate, terrible certainty of the knife was all she could see. The choice was agonizing, a tearing of her very soul. To save her brother, she would have to surrender to the monster, to accept the very fate she had fought so hard to escape. To trust in Jedediah would be to condemn her brother to a potential, and likely, death. Her heart broke, but her voice was steady when she answered. She rose to her feet, a queen surrendering her kingdom to save its last citizen. "I agree," she shouted, her voice ringing with a strange, new authority. "I will go with you, but on my terms." The man across the wash laughed. "You ain't in a position to be making terms. You want me without a fight. You'll listen," she retorted. "The exchange will not be here, not in the dark. It will be at Whiteshell Canyon, at the peak of the next full moon. I will come alone. You will bring my brother, unharmed. That is my price." She had chosen the place of her failed ceremony, a place she knew better than any of Boone's men, a place that was sacred ground. It was a desperate gambit, a way to buy time and perhaps set the stage on ground more favorable to her. The gunman hesitated, considering a public exchange was less ideal, but bringing her in alive and willing was better than a chase. "Fine," he yelled back. "Whiteshell Canyon, full moon, don't be late." He dragged the struggling Caleb back from the ledge and disappeared into the rocks. Ilara stood watching until they were gone, the fight draining out of her. She finally collapsed back to the muddy ground, the weight of her sacrifice crushing her. She had saved her brother, but she had condemned herself. She looked at Jedediah. He sat staring at the empty spot on his belt where his compass used to be. He was a man who had never been lost in his life, a man who could read the stars and the stones, and now, for the first time, he had no map, no compass, and no clear path forward. He had only the raw, burning promise he'd made to a woman he was now honor-bound to deliver to her enemies. ###**, Part 6, The Wolf's Answer to the Moon, ****. The full moon was a stark, silver coin pressed into a velvet sky. It bleached the limestone walls of Whiteshell Canyon to the color of bone and laid a shimmering path across the waters of the sacred creek. The air was cold and still. Each sound the whisper of wind through a creosote bush, the nervous stamp of a horse carrying with a startling clarity. Ilara stood alone in the center of the clearing, a solitary, defiant figure in a place of violated sanctity. She had braided her hair with a single strip of white ceremonial cloth, a symbol of the rite they meant to twist into a chain. They arrived not with the subtlety of thieves, but with the arrogance of conquerors. Silas Boone rode at the forefront, his bulk overflowing his expensive saddle. Beside him, Lieutenant Kincaid sat ramrod straight on his military-issue mount, his face a cold, impassive mask. 4 cavalrymen, their uniforms a mockery of the law they were supposed to uphold, fanned out behind them, their rifles held ready. 2 of Boone's hired guns dragged a bound and gagged Caleb between them. "A beautiful night for a wedding, my dear," Boone boomed, his voice echoing unnaturally in the canyon. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. A bit unconventional, perhaps, but binding all the same. He gestured for his men to bring Caleb forward. They shoved the boy to his knees in the dust. "The arrangement is simple," Kincaid stated, his voice cutting through the night air. Devoid of all emotion, "You will stand before us with Mr. Boone and affirm your consent to this union. My men will serve as official witnesses. A document will be signed. It will all be perfectly legal. Your brother will then be free to go." It was a farce, a grotesque parody of both law and tradition. They weren't just taking her. They were forcing her to legitimize their theft. Elara's gaze was fixed on Caleb, on the fear and fury warring in his eyes. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Asterisk patience, asterisk. "Let's begin," Boone said, stepping beside her. The smell of whiskey and stale cigars rolled off him, a nauseating miasma. He reached for her arm. "Do not touch me," Elara said, her voice low and as sharp as obsidian. Boone chuckled. "Feisty, I like that." From a high ledge, hidden in a deep shadow where the moonlight could not reach, Jedediah watched. The days since the ambush had been a blur of frantic, desperate planning. After getting Cole to safety at Mary O'Rourke's, he had ridden like the devil himself. Not to Prescott, but to a telegraph station 20 miles east, sending a coded message Mary had prepared for the circuit judge, a man she knew despised Kincaid's corruption. They had gambled everything on the hope that a piece of paper could travel faster than a posse. Now, all the pieces were in place. He unslung a heavy deer hide from his shoulder. It was fresh, procured that afternoon, and soaked in blood. He crept to the edge of the precipice overlooking the canyon's western entrance, the path the wolves used when they descended from the high country to drink. He laid the hide across the game trail. It sent a potent, irresistible summons carried on the night breeze. He was not commanding the wild. He was merely setting a table. Nature, in its own time, would answer. Down below, Boone was growing impatient. "Say the words, girl. Say you agree to be my wife." "And if I refuse?" Elara challenged, her chin held high. Kincaid drew his pistol in a single, fluid motion and leveled it at Caleb's head. The consequences would be regrettable. The click of the hammer being cocked was a deafening sound in the silence. Elara's heart seized. It was the moment. Now or never. "Hold." The voice was not loud, but it rang with an authority that stopped every man in his tracks. From behind a tall spire of rock, Deputy Cole stepped into the moonlight. His left arm was in a sling, but his right hand held his Colt, steady and aimed at Boone. Pinned to his vest, his silver star glinted in the moonlight. Boone stared, dumbfounded. "Deputy, what is the meaning of this?" "Silas Boone," Cole said, his voice no longer the nervous stammer of a boy, but the clear tone of a lawman. "By the authority of the Arizona Territory and Circuit Judge Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy, forgery of a federal document, and intimidation of a civilian." He then turned his gaze to the lieutenant. "Lieutenant Ephraim Kincaid, you are under arrest for abuse of authority, conspiracy, and dereliction of your sworn duty as an officer of the United States Army." For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then Boone let out a roar of laughter. "On what grounds? You have no proof, the girl's wild stories." "On the grounds of this," Cole said, pulling a folded document from his coat. It was an official warrant, bearing the judge's signature, and on the sworn testimony of Mary O'Rourke, who has documented your arrangements with other unfortunate women. The judge found it all very compelling. Kincaid's composure finally cracked. A flicker of panic crossed his face. "This is an outrage. My men will not stand for this." "Your men will stand down," Cole commanded, "or they will be charged as co-conspirators." That was when the first howl echoed from the western ridge. It was a long, mournful cry that was answered by another, then another. Boone's men shifted nervously, their eyes darting toward the shadows. The cavalrymen, accustomed to fighting human enemies, looked at Kincaid for orders, but the lieutenant was frozen, his plan unraveling before his eyes. "It's just wolves," Boone snarled, though a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. "Shoot them, shoot all of them." He drew his own pistol and fired wildly into the darkness. The shot was a signal. From the rocks above, Jedediah's pistol barked, and the rifle of one of the cavalrymen was shot from his hands. The night exploded into a maelstrom of gunfire and confusion. The wolves, drawn by the blood and agitated by the noise, began to howl in earnest, their gleaming eyes appearing and disappearing along the high ridges like malevolent spirits. Boone's hired guns, caught between the lawman in front of them and the unseen terrors in the rocks, began to panic. At that same moment, a new sound joined the cacophony, the rush of water. Jedediah had counted on the afternoon shower in the high peaks. A small, fast-moving surge of water, released from the higher elevations, now poured down the creek bed. It wasn't a flood, but it was enough to turn the slick stones of the creek into treacherous footing and the dusty ground into a slick, greasy mud. One of Boone's men slipped in the rising water and fell, his shot going wide. Kincaid, trying to retreat to a more defensible position, scrambled onto a narrow ledge overlooking the creek. The wet rock gave way under his boot. With a cry of alarm, he lost his balance and slid, managing to grab onto a gnarled root just as he went over the edge. He dangled precariously, his fingers slipping, the churning water just a few feet below. Boone saw it all collapsing. His men were scattering, the law had him cornered, and the canyon itself seemed to have turned against him. He turned and ran, not toward the fight, but toward a side canyon that led out to the salt flats, a desperate bid for escape. Jedediah slid down from his perch, landing lightly on the canyon floor. He saw Kincaid, his face ashen with terror, his grip failing. The lieutenant's pistol had fallen, and he was defenseless. For a moment, Jedediah paused. He could let him fall. Justice would be served. It would be an eye for an eye, a fitting end for a man who had brought so much misery. But as he looked at the man's desperate face, he saw not a soldier, not an enemy, but just a man, terrified and about to die. He thought of his father, of the compass that had always pointed true. Honor was not about vengeance. It was about choosing the right path, even when it was the hardest one. He lunged forward, grabbing Kincaid's wrist in a grip of iron. With a powerful heave, he hauled the sputtering, terrified lieutenant back onto the ledge. He did not offer a word, just an act of mercy that was more profound than any judgment. Across the clearing, Boone's escape came to an abrupt end. His desperate flight had led him straight into a patch of ground softened by the surge. His boots sank into the wet, alkaline mud. He struggled, but every movement only mired him deeper, trapping him in a thick, sucking quagmire. The fight was over. The remaining men, seeing their leaders defeated, threw down their weapons. Cole, his face grim, moved to secure them. Caleb, his bonds cut by a cavalryman who had lost his nerve, ran to his sister, embracing her tightly. Jedediah walked to the edge of the salt flat and stood over the trapped and defeated Silas Boone. The big man was helpless, covered in mud, his reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with a pathetic, sticky whimper. In the sudden quiet, broken only by the sound of the receding water and the distant cry of a wolf, Alara walked to the center of the clearing. She looked at the men who had tried to buy her, the brother she had saved, and the man who had stood by her. Then she looked up at the moon, a silent, impartial witness to it all. She drew a small, sharp knife from her belt. With a single, deliberate motion, she sliced through the white ceremonial cloth braided in her hair, letting it fall to the dusty ground. Her voice, when she spoke, was not for them, but for herself, for the spirits of the canyon, and for the vast, listening night. "I am no longer a bargaining chip in a false promise," she declared, her voice clear and resonant. "I am one who chooses my own path." ****, Part 7. A New Wind Through the Valley. ****. The journey back to Dry Bluff was a grim, silent procession. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in soft hues of gray and rose that seemed entirely at odds with the night's violent chaos. Jedediah and a newly deputized Caleb led the way, their rifles held loosely but ready. Behind them, Silas Boone, splattered in mud and defeat, was slung over a horse like a sack of spoiled grain, his hands bound tightly. The 4 disgraced cavalrymen, stripped of their weapons, walked with their heads bowed. Deputy Cole, his arm throbbing but his spirit resolute, escorted the final prisoner, Lieutenant Ephraim Kincaid. A strange quiet existed between Jedediah and the man whose life he had saved. Kincaid had not spoken a word since being pulled from the ledge, but he walked with a new, broken stillness. The armor of his arrogance had been shattered, leaving behind something more human and uncertain. The mercy he had been shown was a debt he didn't know how to repay, and it weighed on him more heavily than any iron shackles could. When they reached the edge of town, Mary O'Rourke was waiting, a lantern in her hand, her face a mixture of anxiety and fierce pride. The arrival of the strange cavalcade brought the town slowly to life, faces appearing in windows and doorways, their curiosity turning to stunned disbelief. The sight of the powerful Silas Boone, brought in as a common prisoner, was a seismic shock to the town's established order. Cole, with a newfound confidence, took charge. "These men are to be held for the circuit judge," he announced to the gawking onlookers. "There's a new wind blowing in Dry Bluff. The old ways are done." In the sheriff's office, Kincaid finally spoke, his voice low and raspy. He addressed Jedediah, not Cole. "You could have let me fall." Jedediah met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "My father taught me that a man's life is not his to take. What he does with that life, that is his own choice." A flicker of something shame, perhaps, or a long-buried ember of honor stirred in Kincaid's eyes. He looked at the warrant on the desk, at Boone being locked in a cell, and made his choice. "The Silver King Consolidated," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The corruption goes all the way to the territorial governor's office. Boone was just the tip of the spear. If the judge is willing to offer a deal, I will tell him everything. I will name every name." It was not an act of redemption, but one of self-preservation. Yet it was a turning of the tide all the same. The rot in Dry Bluff was about to be exposed to the cleansing light of day. The news of the night's events reached the village not as a rumor, but as a fact, delivered by a breathless Caleb. When Alara and Jedediah returned at midday, they were met not with suspicion, but with a profound, humbled silence. Elder Nez was waiting for them outside his hogan. The old man looked as though he had aged 10 years in a single night. The lines on his face were deeper. His shoulders stooped under the weight of his near-fatal misjudgment. He did not speak of shame or curses. He looked at Alara, truly looked at her, and saw not a disobedient girl, but the leader who had saved them from his own blindness. "The marriage contract with Silas Boone is void," he said, his voice resonating through the quiet clearing. He then turned to the assembled women who had gathered behind Alara. "You spoke of a new way, of a trade council, led by our own. I was deafened by fear, and I did not listen. My ears are open now." It was a complete capitulation, a transfer of power born of necessity. That afternoon, the first council of the women of the valley was held, with Mary O'Rourke acting as a bridge to the honest merchants in Dry Bluff. They drafted the terms of a new trade agreement. It was fair, equitable, and based on mutual respect. They would trade their fine woven blankets, their potent herbal remedies, and the beautiful turquoise from their lands not for weapons that stoked fear, but for salt that preserved life, steel for tools, and seeds for new crops. For the first time, the economic future of the village was in the hands of its women, a future Alara had forged from the ashes of her own sacrifice. A few days later, Deputy Cole rode out to the settlement. He was no longer wearing his silver star. He had resigned, knowing he could not serve a system he no longer trusted. But his purpose was not lost. It had merely been refined. "I've bought the old way station on the edge of the territory," he explained to Jedediah and Alara, a quiet passion in his eyes. With Mary's help, I'm turning it into a trading post and a clinic, a place where your people and mine can meet on neutral ground, a place for medicine, not just whiskey and bullets. He had found his own way to be a lawman, not by enforcing flawed rules, but by creating a space of peace and healing where the rules might not be needed. Jedediah had found a new, quiet rhythm in the days following the climax in the canyon. He had helped repair the flood-damaged fences and track the scattered sheep. The familiar tasks a balm to his soul, but a part of him remained adrift. The loss of his father's compass was a constant, hollow ache, a feeling of being unmoored. He had done the right thing. He knew, but the cost had been a piece of his own history, his own direction. One afternoon, as he was restringing his bow near the creek, a small boy from the village, no more than 7 years old, approached him shyly. The boy's hands were clasped behind his back.
"Tracker,"
the boy said, using the name the children had for him.
"I found something."
He brought his hands forward and opened them, lying in his dusty palm. Its silver case miraculously unscratched was the compass. "The water left it in the reeds," the boy explained. "My mother said it belonged to your father. She said it always points to what is true." Jedediah stared at the object as if it were a ghost. He picked it up, its familiar weight a shock in his hand. The glass was intact. The needle quivered for a moment, then settled, pointing steadfastly north. The flood had taken it, but the land, through the hands of an innocent child, had given it back. He looked at the boy, a profound gratitude welling up inside him, too deep for words. He simply placed a hand on the boy's head and nodded. His true north had not been lost, only misplaced. His path, which had seemed so clouded, was clear once more. That evening, the village gathered, not for a trial or a debate, but for a blessing. Elder Nez, his authority now tempered with humility, stood before Jedediah and Alara. He lit a bundle of juniper, its fragrant, sacred smoke curling up into the twilight sky. "We have been blessed with 2 protectors," the elder said, his voice clear and strong. He fanned the smoke over them, a ritual of cleansing and honor, one who is of the rock and the wind, who sees the hidden trails, and one who is of the loom and the corn, who sees the true heart of our people. You were not joined by a false promise, but by a true vow. You kept each other alive, and you kept each other true. You have saved this valley. May you walk in beauty, and may your path forward be a bridge between the worlds. It was not a marriage ceremony, but something more profound. It was an acknowledgement of their bond, a blessing on the future they now had to build together. They did not choose to live within the village, nor did they choose the solitary life Jedediah had once known. They chose a third path. They selected a spot on a gentle rise of land overlooking the sacred creek, a place that stood on the boundary between the Navajo lands and the open territory leading to Dry Bluff. It was a place that belonged to both and to neither, a place where they could be a beginning. With the help of Caleb and others from the village, they began to build. They raised walls of rammed earth, the rich red dirt of the valley itself, cool in the summer and warm in the winter. They laid a roof of strong pine beams and planned for a garden that would grow both corn and the herbs Mary O'Rourke had taught Alara to cultivate. It was to be a home, but more than that, it was to be an embassy of the heart, a testament in wood and mud to the fragile peace they had fought so hard to win. Their future would not be easy, but for the first time, it was their own. ###***, Part 70. Corn pollen and the promise of rain ****. The rains came not as a violent deluge, but as a soft, steady sigh of relief from the heavens. For a week, a gentle, soaking rain fell upon the valley, turning the red dust dark and rich and awakening the deep, sweet scent of the thirsty earth. The sacred creek, which had shrunk to a timid trickle, now ran full and clear, its voice a happy murmur against the stones. In the small garden Alara and Jedediah had tilled behind their new home, the first tiny, vibrant green shoots of corn pushed their way through the damp soil, promises of a future rooted in this land. Their house of rammed earth felt like a part of the valley itself. It stood on its gentle rise, a silent witness to the comings and goings between the village and the wider world. It was a place of quiet strength, its thick walls holding the warmth of the fire at night and the cool of the earth during the day. It was not just a shelter, it was a statement, a home built on the frontier between two worlds, by two people who had decided to be the bridge. One afternoon, as the rain softened to a vain mist, Alara sat at a small wooden table Jedediah had built. The light from the open doorway was soft and gray. Before her lay a precious sheet of paper, a quill, and a small pot of ink purchased from the new trading post Cole had established. She was writing a letter, her hand moving with a slow, deliberate grace. The letter was not for the circuit judge or for any official in a distant town. It was addressed to the women of the mining camps, the ones Mary O'Rourke had spoken of, the ones whose lives had been bartered and sold just as hers nearly had been. Asterisk. We are sisters of a kind. Asterisk, she wrote, the English words feeling both foreign and powerful on her tongue. Asterisk. We have known the weight of a bargain made without our consent, but our hands are not empty and our spirits are not broken. From the profits of a new and fair trade of our wool and our medicine, we are starting a fund. It is not charity, it is a rope, thrown from one woman to another across a canyon of hardship. If you need to buy a passage away from a bad situation, if you need medicine for a sick child, if you need a stake to start a new life, this fund is here. We will help each other. We will be our own saviors. Asterisk. She folded the letter carefully. It was more than just words on a page. It was the first thread of a new blanket, one woven not of wool, but of shared strength and mutual aid. Her own fight had been for her freedom, but the legacy of that fight, she now understood, was the freedom of others. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of peace, one that was earned and watchful. The trial in Prescott had been swift. With Kincaid's damning testimony, the entire corrupt network of the Silver King Consolidated was brought down. Boone was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. The valley was safe. For now. The Trade Council, led by Alara and her mother, flourished. Their blankets and remedies became prized goods in Dry Bluff, and the village, for the first time in a generation, had a surplus of salt and flour. Its future secured not by a single, desperate pact, but by the work of many hands. The shame that had once clung to Alara had transformed into a deep, abiding respect. She had not broken with tradition. She had renewed it, reminding her people that their greatest strength was not in their isolation, but in their integrity and ingenuity. One evening, the last of the rain clouds cleared, leaving the sky scrubbed clean and filled with a breathtaking canopy of stars. A cool, gentle wind blew down from the high country, carrying the scent of pine and wet sage. Jedediah and Alara sat on a simple bench outside their home, a single heavy wool blanket shared across their shoulders. The fire inside cast a warm, flickering glow through the open doorway. For a long time, they sat in a comfortable silence, a language they had perfected in the heart of storms and in the quiet moments between. They watched the moon, no longer a brilliant cold disk of crisis, but a soft, waxing crescent, a sliver of promise in the darkness. "Do you remember?" Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. "How bright the moon was that night." Alara leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt familiar and comforting. "I remember the cold, and the sound of your voice. You sounded like one of the old mountain spirits from the stories." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel the faint smile in his silence. I only remember being afraid I wouldn't get there in time. It was a rare admission of vulnerability from a man who seemed carved from the stone of the canyons themselves. It touched her more deeply than any flowery poem could have. They were bound not by whispered sweet nothings, but by the shared memory of fear, by the feel of a life held precious in the hands of another. She looked out at the valley, now dark and peaceful, the lights of her village a warm, familiar glow in the distance. The railroad was coming. They could hear the faint, rhythmic clang of hammers on steel during the day, a sound carried for miles on the wind. It was a sound of change, of a new world rushing toward them, a world that would bring new challenges, new forms of greed, and new battles to be fought. But the fear she might once have felt was gone, replaced by a quiet readiness. They had a voice now. They had allies in Cole and Mary. They had the strength of their community. And they had each other. Jedediah shifted, pulling the blanket more snugly around them. He looked down at her, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "That night," he said, his voice soft, "I saved you from the wolves." Ilara looked up at him, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. The memory was no longer one of terror, but of a beginning. It was the moment their two solitary paths had converged into one. "And today," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable truth, "together, we saved the valley from wolves in the skins of men." Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to connect with our community. So please leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.